Tonight we are going to look at the longest speech in the book, made by man. Sometime in the story, we don't know where, sometime in the story, a spectator arrives at this great debate. Here are Job and Eliphaz and Bildad and Elihu and Zophar sitting around, and somewhere along the line, Elihu walks in and joins the party. But he hasn't said anything. Nobody says, "Hello, Elihu, how are you?" He's just there. And there isn't a word about him until he starts his speech. He is the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram. Buz was the son of Abraham's brother, Nahor, of Genesis 11:26. Now, maybe the Ram on the end, I thought about this as I was studying it. It says he was of the family of Ram. Now, you could contract Abram, A-B-R-A-M, to the family of Ram, you see? I think he's identifying with Abraham here. And his name means, "My God is he," or "He is my God." That's what Elihu means. And I want you to notice this man. Verse 2. The anger of Elihu. He's mad at Job passionately. It says it burned against Job. He was an angry young man. He was angry at the friends. Verse 3. His anger burned against his three friends because they found no answer. Verse 4. Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he was. He was going to give them first opportunity. Verse 6. Maybe I shouldn't use verse 6. Yeah, middle of it. "I am young in years and you are old." He recognized that he was younger than the rest of them. When he starts speaking, he does so with a little introduction to himself. Tells you a little bit about himself and how he felt. Verses 6 and 7, he says, "I thought age should speak. I was a little shy. I didn't want to interrupt the conversation." Children are prone to do that. Two adults are standing there talking, and the child of one of them comes up and stands there in about 10 seconds if they have an abnormal amount of patience, and 2 if it's normal. And then they interrupt the conversation. They say, "Daddy, Daddy," or "Mommy." And the parents are, "Shh, shh, shh." You know, finally they have to correct them and say, "It's not polite to interrupt the conversation." Why? Elihu says, "Now, fellas, I want to draw attention to the fact that I was a polite young man. I sat here and I listened for a while." But something else, verse 8. "There is a spirit in a man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding." Now he says, I want you to understand, I kept quiet as long as I could, but the inspiration of God was on me, and I just couldn't help it. I have to speak up. God made me this way. I waited out of respect for age. But, verse 9, "The abundant in years may not be wise." You see, I waited for some wisdom from you fellas, but I didn't get any. So finally, my own inspiration took over, and elders don't necessarily understand justice. Now, verse 10. Let me tell you what I think. You know, young people are the same today as Elihu. College students have better answers for how to run our government than our men in office do. And high schoolers know more about life than their parents do. And junior hires are certainly more intelligent than their older siblings. They're always ready to give the next group up all kinds of advice. And this is Elihu. He's typical. He's acting like a young man. And he's going to react that way. There's too much credit given to Elihu by the commentators. Every book I picked off of my shelf, they said, "Now, here comes Elihu on the scene, and he's different from all the rest." And they all laud his speech. Look at the 38th chapter of Job for a minute. God never did this to any of the others. It says in verse 1, "The Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this that darkens counsel by empty words?'" You know who he's talking about? Elihu. Elihu's speech begins in chapter 32 and it ends at the end of chapter 37. And he has talked constantly all the way through, one thing right after another. And God finally says, "Who is the blabbermouth that's giving all this nonsense?" Now, he didn't do that. with Eliphaz, and he didn't do that with Bildad, and he didn't do that with Zophar, and they were not necessarily correct in everything they said. But this young fellow didn't even wait to get interrupted. He didn't give anybody a chance to answer. He started out on his spiel, and he went right smack through it until he shot his wad, and then God said, who in the world is doing all that talking and saying nothing? That's the first one that God intervenes on. I want you to notice something about the characteristic of Elihu's speech. Look back at chapter 32. In chapter 32 alone, there are 26 usages of I or me. Read that speech and understand the emphasis Elihu is putting upon himself over and over and over again. Just for example, look at verse 6. I am young, you are old. I was shy. I was afraid to tell you what I think. I thought age should speak. Verse 10. So I say, listen to me. I too will tell you what I think. Behold, I waited. I listened. While you pondered what to say, I paid close attention to you. What do you notice about his speech? Time and time and time again. Upon whom does Elihu place the emphasis? Upon himself. Now I want you to see the picture that he paints of himself. Look at verse 21. Let me now be partial to no one. I am the most impartial of the four. Verse 21. I will not flatter. When I speak, I am going to speak accurately. I won't tell you you are something you are not. Verse 8. I am inspired. Verse 12. I have been a good listener. And in chapter 33 and verse 6, he says, behold, I belong to God like you. I am godly, I am inspired, I have been a good listener, I am impartial, I will not flatter. He liked himself, didn't he? Elihu had a very, very good picture of Elihu. Now he wants to answer Job. So he begins working on Job's responses to these other men. In Job 33 and verse 8, he says, surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. You say, I am pure and without transgression. Job, if you are pure, verse 13, why are you complaining? You speak like a man with a guilty conscience. If you are pure, why are you complaining that God doesn't tell you about all of his doing? God acts to chasten. Verse 19. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed and with unceasing complaint in his bones. Job, if you have pain by your own testimony, since God uses pain as a punishment, you must not be pure. Verse 29. God does all these things oftentimes with men. God is sovereign and can do exactly as he pleases. 33, 31. Pay attention, Job, and listen to me. Keep silent and let me speak. Then if you have anything to say, answer me, for I desire to justify you. Now what he's saying to him is, Job, your own words prove you guilty. You said you were pure. These three things say you're not. Don't you dare speak out, Job, unless you can prove my accusations wrong, and then I will join with you in saying Job is a pure man. Chapter 34, verse 5. Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my right. Let's take a vote. This is what Elihu says. Look at chapter 34, verse 2. Hear my words, you wise men, and listen to me, you who know, for the ear tests words like the palate tastes food. Let us choose for ourselves what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good. Let's take a vote right now. Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, Elihu, Job. We'll take a vote. And we will decide whether Job really is righteous or not. Oh, and by the way, Job, verse 7, What man is like Job? He's a masochist who drinks up derision like water. Job, you like the attention you're getting. You say you're righteous. But Job, you like what's happening. You like that we're here and that we're paying attention and that we're listening to you. Verse 9. He has said it profits a man nothing when he is pleased with God. Job, all you're interested in God for is what you get out of God. You're not interested in God for God. That's not righteous. You're only interested in God for being a big Santa Claus. You're only interested in God for what God can give you. Don't talk about being righteous, Job. You've said this. Chapter 34, verses 10 to 15. He says, God does not act unrighteously. In fact, in verse 15, 14 and 15, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to the dust. God isn't unrighteous. God gives everybody breath. If God took his hand off of the universe capriciously, everything would fold up and die. And from verses 21 through verse 30, he says, listen, God is so knowledgeable that he looks down into the inner parts of man. He knows them exactly the way they are. So Job, if you think you're righteous, you're not. You're not. You're guilty because you imply that God is unfair and are asking him for an audience. And he says that pretty much in verses 31 to 37. For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastisement, I will not offend any more? Teach me what I do not see if I have done iniquity, and so on. Job, verse 36, Job ought to be tried to the limit because he answers like wicked men. You know what Elihu was saying? Elihu was saying that anybody who defends himself is automatically guilty. That's what he's saying. He's saying, Job, you're automatically guilty. Job, you think you're so good. Chapter 35, verses 1 through 16. Job, you think you're so good. In verses 2 through 8, he hits him with a whole series of charges. You think this is according to justice? Do you say my righteousness is more than God's? Job, do you think you are a better thinker about these things than God is? And down the line through a bunch of them. In verses 9 through 13, he says, I'll tell you why God doesn't answer. Because no one is saying, where is God my master? Job, you're not saying, hey, God, I'll turn everything over to you. You're saying, I'll defend myself before God. That's why God doesn't answer. You just think you're better than what you are. Now look at verse 13. He really hits him. Verse 13 of this chapter 35. Surely God will not listen to an empty cry, nor will the Almighty regard it. Job, your cry is phony. Now there are modern-day Elihus. There are modern-day Elihus who automatically assume that if a person prays and God doesn't do what the person asks for, that there's something wrong in the person's heart. And they turn around and say, you're a phony. That's not the case with Job. Remember the story? Job was being afflicted not because Job was sinful, not because Job did something wrong, but because Satan desired to put Job to a test and God to a test to find out if the relationship between them was real or not. God knew it was, and Job knew it was, but Satan wouldn't believe it. And Satan was the one who was causing the whole problem. Now, Job didn't know what was going on. Job had to go through it just like we do without that piece of information of what was going on. But Elihu automatically comes along and says, your prayer has not been answered. I told my mother that I told you what she said at the airport. And she said, you didn't. And my father said, I thought we were past the stage where we got into your sermon. And I said, nope, not yet. It won't be for a long time to come either. But I chuckled because when I got off of that airplane and my mom took one look at me with a beard and she said, I prayed last night that you wouldn't have a beard when you arrived at Grand Rapids. And she said, the Lord didn't answer my prayer. And I said, he did too, Mom. He just said, no. God doesn't always have to say yes, does he? No. But we make the assumption that if God doesn't say yes, there's something wrong with us or something wrong with the way we pray. Where have we gotten this idea from? From the Elihus. Elihu says, Job, The reason God isn't answering your prayers, there's no faith behind your prayer. Your cry is empty, it's vain, it's capricious. You're not talking out of reality. Job, your prayer life is a farce. And it wasn't. Because God is going to answer. And it isn't Job that God is going to say darkens counsel with words that have no knowledge. It's Elihu God is going to say that about. What he's going to show Job is that the sum total of the conclusions they have come to about God is right, but the conclusion they came to about Job was wrong. Everything they say about God is correct. God is as great a God as these three men describe, or four. He's a greater God than they describe. God asks more questions. Next week we're going to look at God's speech to Job. God asked more questions of Job than all of these fellows put together. Their high view of God is correct. But what they did with it was very, very wrong. Now he says also in chapters 35 and 36 that even at what I've said, Job, God does not always use affliction just to punish. Sometimes he does it to teach. If you will, look at verses 7 and 8 of the 36th chapter. I got the right one? Yes. He does not withdraw his eye from the righteous, but with kings on the throne, he has seated them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in fetters and are caught in the cords of affliction, then he declares to them their worth. He uses it as a teaching instrument. Look at verse 15. He delivers the afflicted in their affliction and opens their ear in time of oppression. We were talking in the Sunday school class this morning about wealth. Man is much more responsive to God when he's in poverty than he is when he's at everything's wealthy. Everything's well-to-do. Everything's taken care of. Because we become too confident in our things or in what we have. And Elihu says, God may take it all away, Job, just so you seriously listen to what God has to say. Verse 22, behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Now, isn't that true? Isn't that absolutely true? Sure. Some of what Elihu says is very true, just like the other speaking. Chapter 37, verse 23. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. God will never do the wrong thing. He's right again. There are some great truths in Elihu's speech. Everything he says is not incorrect. He has a very, very high view of God and of his works. He has a correct view of man's relationship to God. Turn back to the 36th chapter, verse 25. All men have seen it. Man beholds from afar. Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him, and the number of his years is unsearchable. He draws up the drops of water. They distill rain from the mist, which the clouds pour down, and they drip upon man abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds? Oh, what a view of God Elihu had. Now you see, in general principles, he's correct. But in his application of his general principle, he is wrong. So here are some lessons from four mouths. First of all, man is capable of developing some good, sound views about God. He's capable of it. Elihu did. Eliphaz did. Bildad did. They came from different approaches. Eliphaz from his experience. Bildad from tradition. Zophar from dogma. They all developed ideas of God. Elihu from who knows what source. He doesn't tell his source. But they all come in with a view of how great God is. That's true. That's very true. The general observation of all of them, from whatever point they approached it, they came to the same conclusion. Man has a beautiful reasoning capacity given to him by God. Now, here's another thing we have to learn from the book of Job. Man cannot always go from the generality to the specific case. We have two faults among us as human beings. We want to have one rule which we apply to everyone, exactly alike. The other fault is we take one case and develop a rule which we want to apply to everyone. That may not sound like a lot of difference, but it is. we like to make a rule. I sat in Greek class and learned the rules. Oh, the first semester of Greek in Bible school is a tough one. You got to learn all those rules and how the words are constructed, and they teach you the endings, and they say this is a masculine ending and this is this case, and they go on down the line with all of that, and then they show you the endings for the verbs and how to decipher them and be able to pick them out. Spend a whole first semester, first year learning that. And then we came to class to start the second year of Greek, and the professor looked at us and he said, now this year, what we are going to have to study are the exceptions. You know, there were more exceptions than there were things that fit the case. One of the largest classes of the verbs is the me verbs in Greek. They end with mi. They're called me verbs. They're different from the normal run of verbs. So after you learn exactly how they work, then you got to learn how the exceptional ones work. And then there are a few that don't fit in any known category. They're all by themselves. You've got to learn those. And then there are words that do funny things. They drop a letter here or add a letter there. And if you end a word in a certain way and begin a word in a certain way, you got to stick a letter in the middle so you can say it. Otherwise you couldn't say the sounds together. It wouldn't be speakable. So you start learning all the exceptions. I remember studying German in high school, and the German teacher taught us the rules. And we learned where to put the umlaut and why to do it and how to pronounce it. And it was kind of fun listening to that fellow sing the other night in German. He sang a little bit of one of the operatic songs in German. And he did a beautiful job, by the way. If you didn't have German, his pronunciation was excellent. He knew how to use the umlaut and even sing it, and that's pretty good. So I remember learning that in school. That was the first year. You know, I started learning in the second year in German? The exceptions. And then it was French in college. And you study the French in the first year, they teach you all the rules, and the second year, all the exceptions. Now, these fellows had a rule. By their rule, which simply stated was this: God blesses men who are righteous and just and holy, and he punishes men who are out of line because of sin. That's the rule. Since Job is suffering right now, he must therefore be being punished. But that wasn't the case with Job. You see, they lacked some information. They lacked the information of Satan's contest with God. They lacked any information about any other kind of condition than that which they had carried out from their own conclusions. And they didn't know what to do with Job. And it seems to me that the book of Job ought to provide man with a very excellent example of why the Lord Jesus Christ said, judge not, that you be not judged. Now, some people have carried that rule too far, you see. Today there's a tendency among us as believers to say, okay, God says don't judge one another, therefore nobody's ever to tell anybody that something is wrong. That isn't what the Lord Jesus Christ was saying. Sin is still sin, isn't it? If it's wrong according to the Word of God, we ought to say it's wrong. But you see, they couldn't point to anything in Job and say, this is what you did that was wrong. This is why it's happening. What they were saying is, Job, look down inside of you someplace. There's a rottenness inside of you somewhere that has caused this thing. We may not know what it is, but you know what it is, and God knows what it is, and God is punishing you for it. If they could have pointed to something and come and said, Job, on the 31st of August of that year, you did this, and on the 15th of August of that year, you did this, and these are in violation of what God said. They couldn't do it. So they had to come with their general rule, and their general rule was, blessing comes when man is right with God, and judgment comes when man is wrong with God, and it looks like Job is being judged, therefore Job must be wrong with God. That's taking the general rule and applying it to the case. Try it the other way around. Suppose they saw a case where a man flagrantly sinned, and God punished him. Then they extrapolate the rule out this way. They say, aha, that man sinned. He lost his family, he lost his farm, he lost his fields, he lost his barns, he lost his caravans. Therefore, God must always punish sin. You see, they build a rule out of the case. And that's not always true. Because David the psalmist said, Lord, why is it that the godly man languisheth and the ungodly man seems to have it more? You see, we'd like a rule. We'd like to be able to peg God down into categories. We'd like to be able to fit everything so neatly. One of the big problems that a Jehovah's Witness raised with me one time, he said, I cannot buy the concept of a triune Godhead because I cannot understand that. And my thought was, praise the Lord. I don't want a God that I can understand in entirety. Because if I can understand Him in entirety, I'm bigger than He is. That's not the Word of God doesn't say I can understand Him completely. God says, my ways are unsearchable. My judgments are past finding out. My ways are not like your ways. My ways and my thoughts are higher than yours, like the stars are above the face of the earth. But it does say that my God understands me. He knows me down to the least little detail. I'm no mystery to God. God may be a great mystery to me, but I'm no mystery to God. And I really thank God that it is that way. You see, these men are just typical of us as human beings. They wanted everything to be pegged and put upon a category and say, you do this, God does that. You do this, God does that. You do this, God does that. And they couldn't break out of that rigid, inflexible set of rules that they had set up from their own traditions and observations, and as a result, even though they had a very, very high view of God, they had a view of a God with no feeling, no compassion, no understanding of man. They had a God who was locked into a system that could not bend, or else it would break. And they didn't know what to do with a man like Job. So here's Elihu, and he's arguing. He comes to exactly the same conclusion as the other three fellows. He tells them all off, then he comes to the same conclusion. Here's the difference. They tried to correct Job out of what they reasoned from the past. Elihu tries to correct Job out of Job's own thought process. He tries to take Job's words and convict Job with his own words. Elihu is like that skillful prosecuting attorney who's after the fellow on the witness stand to impeach him as a witness. And he tries to make him eat his own words. That's what Elihu does. Eliphaz doesn't bother with that. He says, Job, I want to tell you what I have seen. Bildad doesn't bother with that. He says, Job, I want to tell you what came down from my father and grandfather and great-grandfather and all the way back in time. Zophar doesn't bother with it either. Zophar says, this is the way it is. But Elihu tries to take his words and turn them around and make Job eat his own words. He's a skillful prosecuting attorney. The interesting thing is that of all of the speakers, this one is the longest. He goes on and on and on and on and on. And it's kind of like the old proverb. Give a man enough rope, and what will he do? Hang himself. Because finally Elihu just sort of runs out of gas. You read the speech, that's what happens. He just sort of runs out of gas and stops. And then God interrupts and says, what's all that noise anyway? Who has said all those words without knowledge? And that's the biggest secret of the whole thing. All of these men who are working on Job are trying to explain spiritual events out of human reasoning, and it is beyond the capability of man. What they should have been doing is joining Job in prayer and asking God for wisdom, asking God to speak. Instead, out of the source of their own head and their own feeling and their own thinking, they came up with answers that were not true. And the lectures of man come to an end with Elihu. Now the speeches are really done. The youth has spoken up. He has laid it all on the table. And after that, God is going to speak. Next Sunday night, we're going to look at God's message to this whole thing. What does God have to say? He's going to break his silence. Job has been saying all along, why doesn't God just speak with me? Well, you see, maybe at this point, Job is finally ready. Every kind of approach that man could use has now been exhausted. And Job still doesn't have his answers. And finally, after all of man's tries and man's explanations, maybe he's ready to sit still and listen to what God has to say. I'm going to tell you one little secret in advance about what God says. He never answers Job. He never tells him what was going on. Now you read God's speech to Job between now and next Sunday night, and I think you'll discover that God does not ever tell Job what the story is. He doesn't. All he tells him in that effect is, I am God, and you are man. Trust me. Trust me. You know, there are a lot of people asking a lot of questions about God today. How can God be loved if people go to hell? How can God hold man unaccountable or accountable if he's never heard about Jesus Christ? How can God do this? And how can God do that? You know what the trouble is? We want to create God in our image instead of letting him be God. And Elihu and Eliphaz and Zophar and Bildad all had a view of God that they developed, and they could not understand anything that was different than that view. And instead of helping Job, they increased his miseries. Finally, God steps in. A little bit of the human scene of what's going on. And this last speaker, now if you have a commentary on Job, you pick it up. And I think you're going to find that the commentators say, now we get a real good sound man in there who's giving a lot of good counsel. But he's not. He's no better than the rest of them. In fact, he is even a little more proud and vain and talkative than the rest, until God finally has to say, what kind of noise is this anyway? Maybe that's why Moses said to the people of Israel, stand still and see the salvation of our God. Maybe that's why Elijah had to sit up there on that mountainside and wait until a windstorm raged and the earthquake stopped and the fire had crackled its way out until the still small voice spoke. Maybe that's why God says, be still and know that I am God. Maybe we have to exhaust, like these men did, exhaust all of that human nonsense before we're ready to sit down and listen to the voice of God. Maybe that's a secondary message in the book of Job. Huh? Wouldn't it be great if we would shortcut that and without going through all of that speech making, sit down and listen to the voice of God as it's given in his word, and pay attention to it, and listen carefully, and search it, and study it the way we should. Let's pray. John.